Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Once again, I'm joined by Ijaz Trini one more time. And I was so disappointed, Ijaz. I thought that was going to be it. I thought that was the end of our relationship. But Colin had to respond, which was a surprise. A surprise for me.
I was not
I,
surprised. I actually was looking forward to his response, but it did
hmm.
leave me disappointed, I have to say. For a guy whose channel is named Islam Critiqued, he does a pretty bad job of critiquing us, I have to say.
Ah, yalla.
Let's get this ball on the road, shall we?
It is what it is. Let's start. Bismillah. Go for it.
Welcome back, everyone. Today's video is an exercise in irony. I'm going to be doing a response video to show you why I don't do response videos. So I'll
Indeed, he should not do response videos, and you're about to find out why.
be responding.
By the way,
respond.
I want to point out something really important here. Colin made a video about me before I made any videos about him. Yeah, it was a response to me quoting Zakir Hussein's debate with David Wood.
Yes.
So he started off the whole this thing is going on between us and him. He started it, so
I want to point out one more thing. The videos that we are responding to initially were videos he made about Muslim arguments about the authorship to the Bible. So it's only fair that if he makes a video about Muslim arguments, we have to respond. And now he's saying this is why he doesn't do responses. Your whole channel is focused on responding to people like us, and it does not make sense. But let's continue.
A couple of things to talk about here. Ijaz is referring to my quote of D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo, where they say there's no evidence that the Gospels ever circulated anonymously or without an appropriate designation. And Ijaz, in response, refers to P1, and he also refers to Philip Comfort's commentary. So let's look at P1. First, what you're seeing on your screen is the entirety of P1. This is Matthew 1:1 and Matthew 1:14, according to the label that CSNTM has given it. That's Dan Wallace's organization. So we can go to the first page and zoom in, and here we have the beginning, and you can see right up here where my mouse is that this is an alpha for page 1. Now the assumption here is that this top margin is intact and that it has no title. And so this is what Ijaz is talking about. Look, you have no title on P1, therefore this is evidence against what Carson and Moo state. However, this is simply a dramatic overstatement of the data. As a matter of fact, titles in the ancient world came in a variety of places. Sometimes.
Let's pause right there. So I want you to notice the shift in the goalpost here. Initially, the argument was all of the surviving manuscripts circulate with a title.
right.
Now he's acknowledging, okay, this manuscript, let me show it to you. In the top margin, it does not have a title there. So he's already accepted that that's a bad argument. And what is he shifting it to? He's now saying, well, it could be in other places, and you should not use this lack of a title here and this surviving evidence as an evidence. Wrong. We can use it because that's where we would naturally expect a title. He's going on to explain next that there were 3 forms of a title: inscriptio at the top of a page, subscriptio at the bottom of the document, and then you have a title page. Now, we neither have a title page for this manuscript, and the other pages don't survive, so there is no evidence of a subscriptio, a title at the end of the document. Rather, the pages that survive, the most important one, is the one where the gospel begins. And we can clearly see in the image that he showed, there is no title there. So just to be clear, his argument was that they all have titles in what has survived, and all I've done is demonstrated here is a document with the gospel without a title. So that argument has been refuted entirely, and now he's shifting it to 2 other options which cannot be evidenced. It's a bit of a weird tactic, but it's a goalpost shift.
Yeah, very clear, very clear.
You would have what we would call a in front. That could be the case with a papyrus like this, where the title page was lost. Sometimes the titles appear as running headers throughout the manuscript. Sometimes they're attached on tags. This is particularly true with scrolls. Sometimes, ironically, they come at the end of the body of a text. And so titles can appear in all sorts of places, not just the top margin on a manuscript. Now, since Ijaz mentioned Dr. Philip Comfort, I gave Dr. Comfort a call and said,
Let's just pause there. I want you to pay attention to what he says next, right? So I referenced P1 as having no title. I pointed to the manuscript evidence, and the person whose assessment I pointed out was Dr. Philip Comfort in his work, New Testament Text and Translation Commentary. So pay attention. He says he gave Philip Comfort a call, and I want you to listen very closely to the words that he says. You will notice that Philip Comfort never says Ijaz is wrong. Of course, there should have been a title on an attached page. I want you to pay attention. Listen to what he says.
Okay.
what do you think about this? I read Carson and Moo's quote to him. We talked about P1 and some other ancient manuscripts for a while, and he agreed that yes, it is an overstatement to take a fragmentary manuscript like P1 and extrapolate from it that P1 circulated anonymously, much less the Gospels as a whole. And so,
stop. What did I reference Philip Comfort into? That P1 had no title. He now shifts the argument to, he just used that to say that none of the Gospels had titles. La, I never said that. So he overstates what he thinks I said to get a response that my statement was an overstatement without refuting the core idea that P1, as Dr. Comfort agrees, does not have a title for an inscriptio at the start of the page. So this whole charade is basically meaningless because he can't engage with the point he initially made that P1 should have had a title.
So I was here dramatically overstating his case. Now let's go to the second category I have, which is called in my folder Incomplete Engagement with My Work. And this is something that I don't appreciate too much from Ijaz and Fareed. I'm going to play you clips from 249 in their video, 1308, 1454, 2826, and 2852. That's where these clips will begin. And then we'll see the way that this should have been handled later on in their videos. Now, my problem with the way they presented my material is this. I have a significant amount of information and various arguments in my introduction video to the series that they're responding to. And I even reference the intro video in my video on Mark, and they don't include any of this data in their response.
Should we?
Let's just stop. Let's just stop. Brother Fareed, there were 5 videos that he did. After 5 videos, the first one, he reused almost all of the material in the subsequent 4. So for him to say that is why we didn't respond to the first video where he gave those arguments, because he reused almost every single quote and every single evidence in the subsequent videos. So we did watch that first video, we analyzed it separately, of course, and then we both came to the conclusion, well, it's plain that he uses these same sources in the rest. So no, Colin, we did take it into consideration and we paid greater attention that we think we paid to it. Just to point out here, we did watch the first video, and anyone can go back and double check. The exact same quotes are repeated throughout. Is that correct, Brother Fareed? Just let me know.
Yeah. Colin, if you'd like us to go through the first video, if you believe that it's something that's just irrefutable, there's too much data there that we can't handle, please just drop a request in the comments section. We'll gladly go through it.
Zero problems here. I'm in for it as well. That gives me an extra opportunity to do another video with Fareed. So please go ahead.
Habibi.
Let's continue.
Now, Fareed presents my case as if it is one line of evidence, as if I'm only relying on early church tradition. And in fact, I've presented arguments in the introduction video for Greek.
Stop. Did we not just look at manuscript evidence, Brother Fareed?
Yeah.
So we did address each evidence that he made. That's why the video was an hour long. So
right.
Dishonesty. Let's continue.
Syntax for practical evidence, practical concerns with the way the titles were regarded in the 2nd century, as well as from early manuscripts themselves. So my argument is not just one dimension, it's actually multiple dimensions. And they're presenting my arguments to their audience as if I only have one argument, one line of evidence, early church tradition. And so the same thing occurs with John. I saved my material for the identification of John. Guess what? For my video on the Gospel of John. And
Brother Fareed, should we let him know? Should we? I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, we could drop that anytime. So yeah, we do have a video out.
So he
It's
thinks, Brother Floyd, he thinks we didn't watch that video and that we wouldn't engage with the evidences in it. Just to,
yeah.
just to point out, we watched all your videos, bro. We studied them. We know what we're doing. So this whole charade of one-dimensional argument, we've proved that to be wrong. Two, that we didn't engage with all of the evidence, wrong. We have something in the works. Like, just wait, just wait. Right now, Brother Floyd, just correct me. The video for Luke came out. Yeah,
Yep.
the video for Luke is out. So, Colin, if you want the video for John, just drop a comment. And the
Yeah,
map is
please.
finished. Done.
Please.
Done.
We'll do it for you, Colin, anytime. Maybe.
Not the case, so it's unfortunate that's how that was handled.
Fake news.
Let's move on to a glaring non sequitur with the issue of Rebecca. So this is going to start at 12:20 in their video. Here's a glaring non sequitur. The argument seems to be, you reject rabbinic tradition, and specifically he's referring to times I've singled out rabbis that simply read things into the text and act like they're part of the biblical story, or I should reject early Christian history. This is absolute nonsense. There are different styles of writing, different types of writing, different genres. They have different purposes, and they should both be evaluated critically. And when you evaluate rabbinic eisegesis, it doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. The rabbis are simply doing their own thing, all right? The better analogy would be, let's say I accepted the Gospel of Peter, but then I rejected rabbinic interpretation. That would be more of a similarity, because the Gospel of Peter gives us information about the resurrection. Jesus comes out of the tomb, he's super tall, there's a cross following him, the cross is talking, and so forth. And so clearly, later writers have come in and inserted details that are filling in perceived gaps in the story. And so there's a lot of similarity, actually, between the way some rabbinic tradition works and the way some of the New Testament Apocrypha works.
Okay.
Rejected the other, it would be possible for him to draw a parallel there and say I'm being inconsistent. But it is simply a demonstrable, glaring non sequitur to say that I'm inconsistent because I reject rabbinic eisegesis, but also accept some church history.
Again, you believe that they did eisegesis, so you reject their point of view. I am saying that you've applied the same method to the scholars you believe in, and you've read into the text identities which are not clear from the text themselves. That's all we're saying. So it's not a non sequitur. I understand that you have to disagree with us, because if you don't, it looks as if you can't contend. But the point is, any response does not mean a good response, and that was not a good comment. It's a really bad argument, and I would say a lack of your understanding of logic in its entirety. Let's continue.
This clip begins 141.
So it says, yet as we have seen, there is nothing in the New Testament that is inconsistent with Papias' claim that Mark wrote the second gospel, except for Mark, whoever the author was of the Gospel of Mark, not saying who they were. That would be the first problem. Right?
Okay, so the silence of Mark on its authorship is an argument against the authorship of Mark. That is, the silence, the technical anonymity of the Gospel of Mark is inconsistent with Mark writing it.
Let's stop there. So the argument from silence has a valid form and an invalid form. So would we expect the author of a historical work to identify himself? Yes. So in this case, we expect that he would have identified himself. As Colin himself argues, he believes the titles circulated with the names of the authors. Therefore, my argument is therefore correct. He has the same expectation that I do, that they should have had a title, and therefore the lack of that title from the scholar that he was quoting is demonstrative of a valid form of the argument from silence. You will now see him try to say Ijaz accepts one form of the argument from silence but rejects another. And I do, because one is valid and the other is invalid. This is what happens when you don't study logic and you just, apparently from this video, from the top of his head without any actual study. Let's continue.
That to me sounds like an argument from silence, but listen to what he says later on in this clip.
The second problem, he says, and since we have no indication that anyone in the early church contested Papias' claim. Now, this is an argument from silence, because we don't know if anyone did contest it.
This is very interesting. In a clip that's about 25 seconds long, he both appeals to an argument from silence and criticizes arguments from silence.
Because he doesn't understand the valid and invalid forms. Simple.
Let's take a closer look at this argument from silence. So let's look at the claim one more time. Second line down on the right. And since we have no indication,
if he responds, it's going to be an issue because we're going to have 3 boxes of you and me.
I'm going to tell you now, I'm pretty certain he's not going to respond because, can I just give you my personal view, Brother Food, just quickly?
Yeah.
All videos are a problem for him. Why? Because now he has to go further into the details. So all the layered assumptions he had made, all the summaries that he had conjectured in his mind, they're not sufficient. Now he has to go into the nitty-gritty details. And the problem with that is that once you go into the details, it demonstrates that his points aren't valid, that his claims for the historicity of the titles are invalid, and the identities behind them. So he's actually trying as hard as he could to go down that route. Whereas you and I are saying, no, we want you to go down that route. Please respond, continue to respond, because we would enjoy deconstructing your points further. Let's continue.
I do believe, I also do agree with you. I don't believe he's going to respond because, I mean, the title of his latest video is, what was it? What is it again?
Refusing, why I
don't do response videos. Yeah, خلاص. And this is him saying, I don't need to deal with these guys. It's a one-time thing. I'm going to end them with this one video, and that's it. No matter what they do, doesn't matter if they put out Matthew and Luke and John, I'm done. That's what he's saying here.
He's throwing in the towel before the match has even begun. This is just the preliminary stuff, guys. Are you sweating because of these quotes, Brother Farid? I don't see any sweat on you. I'm not sweating either because it's not a problem. Let's continue. Yeah?
Yep.
That anyone in the early church contested Papias' claim, we see no reason not to accept it. Now, regarding the argument for silence, I want to show you what 2 scholars have to say about this. The first quote is from Daniel Ulusi that you see on the top, and he, in his article, is not trying to argue against the Gospels originally being circulated anonymously. So his perspective is a bit different from the second scholar I'm going to show you. He says, given far-flung Christian groups spread across the Mediterranean, this unanimous agreement on the naming of the texts would constitute a Septuagint-esque miracle. Funny way of wording.
Let me stop there. Do you see the name of this author in the first quote, Daniel Uluchi?
Yeah.
Let me read what Daniel Uluchi himself says in that very same article. This goes to tell you that Colin either did not pay attention or he intentionally chose to not point out what his conclusions were. So he says on page 106, the standard critical model is far shakier than many imagine, right? So he says that the scholars who argue for the anonymity of the Gospels, their method is a bit shaky. But then he continues, the central problem is that the standard critical model rests on assumptions about early Christian ideology to explain, 1, why the gospel authors wrote anonymously, and 2, why anonymous texts were consumed by Christians at large until the 2nd century, when a different set of interests led to the text being associated with apostolic authorship and authority. Let's continue. He says here, I would like to suggest that materialist approaches can provide firmer ground for the basic claims of the standard critical model. I am arguing that the basic conclusions of the standard critical model are correct, though for the wrong reasons. So he's criticizing the method used to arrive at the conclusions, but he's saying that using his alternative method, he comes to the same conclusions. So it betrays the point to appeal to the guy who confirms what you, Farid, and I, Ijaz, believe in. He comes to the exact same conclusions. And I would suggest, what Colin does not do, I would suggest that people read this paper because what he points out deconstructs most of Colin's videos. It is actually brilliant. Let us continue, yeah?
We'll link it in the description, inshallah.
And Gathercole, who argues from a different perspective, says 2nd century Christian literature is replete with references to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authors of Gospels, and there's never any sense that the Gospels were anonymous or written by others. Now, I'm showing you 2 scholars who have 2 different approaches and different conclusions on this issue, but they both agree that this argument from silence is an important data point, namely that we don't have any competing traditions about who wrote the Gospels. But why shouldn't we dismiss this as simply an argument from silence that's irrelevant? Well, there are clearly degrees of arguments from silence. So if someone comes to me and says that there's no archaeological evidence for the existence of Abraham, therefore Abraham didn't exist. That's a very weak argument from silence because we don't expect to find much evidence. But when we look at the early traditions about the authorship of the Gospels, and we see a stack of evidence on one side and then nothing on the other, that is a significant data point. It's
Let's point out here. He's saying that that's a significant data point that no one that he's aware of contests who wrote the Gospels. Here is the problem, though. The scholars plainly point out that we expect that they would have identified themselves, and we expect, as Colin believes, that they use their names on the title. Now, the thing is, when it comes to ancient literature, if it's already well known or people generally believe that a particular person wrote something, it doesn't matter that they agree with it. What matters is what does the source actually say itself. So something in popular imagination does not translate well to the genesis of that point in the first place. So again, his point here seems to be a bit irrational to me. I understand what he's trying to say. I'm sure you do as well. But the point is, you can't say no one disagreed when the truth is we don't even have the entirety of Papias's work. We don't have the entirety of the work of people at that time. So it's a bit silly to say, therefore, no one ever contested it. Rather, the point should be nothing has survived where those contests still remain, but that does not mean historically no one ever contested it. Let's continue.
rather argument from silence, as various scholars across the spectrum acknowledge. This clip begins at 3806. Picture of the disciples as cowardly, spiritually blind, and hard of heart is particularly vivid in Mark. This, it is held, points to an apostolic viewpoint, for only an apostle would have been able to criticize the 12 so harshly.
That's just silly, man. That's just silly. Like this would not fly. This would never fly in the Hadith. This would never fly. We don't know what the source is, but he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there, or he criticizes the characters in the event. Therefore, he must have been. It's just absolutely absurd.
He criticized the source, therefore he must have been there.
But he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there.
Who is the he? Is that the author of Mark? Is that one of the apostles? And where is the there? And why is this relevant to the authorship of the Gospel of Mark? Let's go back to the quote. Carson and
Did your point just fly completely over his head? Because that's what just happened.
they state the case modestly. This points to an apostle or an apostolic viewpoint, because who is more likely to criticize the 12? Some lowly scribe who's writing the gospel, or one of the 12? It seems that this criticism would come from someone in a higher position.
Can you pause it?
Yeah.
طيب. I'm going to talk about what I see in Ilm al-Hadith, what I see in the Islamic tradition. For example, so much of the criticisms that are directed at the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, are from Shi'i narrators. Some that came 100 years later, 200 years later, 300 years later, 400 years later, and they don't even have to be important figures. They just be people with hatred in their hearts. They don't have to be people that are looked up to as authorities.
I want to point out as well, in literary criticism is actually quite common, I think, for a person to criticize their predecessors, especially if it's useful for the narrative. So Jesus criticized the disciples. I will include that. I will continue that criticism, but then I will end up saying that they were redeemed at the end because they came to true belief after seeing Christ crucified, and potentially there was a resurrection. Not for the Gospel of Mark, but this is what he believes in. So I don't see why that would be a point against what you said, Brother Farid. In fact, your point was so valid, it just seems like Colin missed it completely.
Well, akhi, subhanAllah, there are so many reasons for a random narrator of hadith to criticize, a predecessor. So many reasons. Stuff that have to do with tribes, stuff that have to do with political affiliation, stuff that had to do with what I said, sectarian differences. To assume that, oh, we don't know who this is, therefore he must have been a Sahabi. It just doesn't work, man.
It doesn't. It's a really bad argument, and I can't believe that Colin actually uploaded that segment. If I were him, I would actually delete it. But let's continue. Yep.
But
Their only point. Somehow that simple quote gets twisted into this.
we don't know who the source is, but he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there.
We see this a lot, actually, very emotional responses, and
That was a logical point. It's the exact argument he's making.
He's given 3 evidences to prove that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. Now, the first point he makes is that Peter figures prominently in Mark. Yes, he does. No one denies that. But him being an important figure could generally mean he was an important figure in the early church, and this person knew that fact. That does not mean merely because Peter was important that this somehow proves that the author of Mark knew Peter. But the second one, the pattern of the gospel, similar to Peter's words in Acts chapter 10, verses 36 to 41. So the pattern of speaking is something, again, which is suggestive and indicative as opposed to determinative.
notice what I said. Point 2, Peter's influence.
Let's just stop there. I want people who follow Colin and watch his videos to realize what he's just conceded. He agrees with us that all of the evidence he cited to prove that Mark was the author is not determinative but just indicative. So he actually agrees with us, and he alludes to it. I just wanted to point that out. Do you agree with that, Brother Fareed?
Yeah.
Let's continue. So he agrees. Remember that as you watch this video, Colin, despite disagreeing overall, tends to accept our points, but just pushes them aside.
Carson suggested 3 other factors that point to Peter's influence in the Gospel of Mark. Point 2, Peter's influence.
The pattern of speaking is something, again, which is suggestive and indicative as opposed to determinative.
The pattern of speaking is something that's suggestive and indicative. But let's go back and listen to what I said. Now, Boo and Carson suggested 3 other factors that point to Peter's influence in the Gospel of Mark. So when you compare the language that I use at the beginning of this clip with what Ijaz says later, it appears he agrees with me. So what?
Hold on. Brother Fareed, quick question. Did he publish that video to argue that Mark was the author of Mark? So I'm taking his overall context and argument into consideration. He misses that point entirely. Bro, just go back and watch the title of your video, then come back to me. Let's continue, yeah?
What does he do? He disagrees with his own restatement of my argument, which is called a straw man.
He's given 3 evidences to prove that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark.
So did I say prove? No, I didn't. I never used language that strong. I'm talking about the influence of Peter on the Gospel of Mark. Listen to.
Hold on.
That's good.
Hold on. Let's point out something here. That video was to respond to Muslims who argue that Mark did not write Mark. So if he is acknowledging now that was not the purpose of the video, then why, 1, did he title it that way, and 2, why did he use the arguments that he used? So he seems to be of 2 minds here. So if you're a Christian, I want you to understand, in all of the scholarship that he has read, he still does not have the courage to say that he has proved that Mark wrote Mark. He agrees with us, Brother Fareed. So if you're a Christian, don't tell a Muslim that Colin disproved that Mark wrote Mark. Rather, he's uncertain. He's not sure. He is suggesting, and he is claiming he agrees with us. Brother Fareed, he agrees with us.
So we can count these points that he's mentioned over in this section of the video to be supplementary matters that push towards Mark being the author, but nothing conclusive. And طيب, okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Let's continue.
What he said. Yeah.
So it does not actually follow through that because the pattern of speech is similar, that it means it's the same. In fact, it's of note that Colin does not flesh this point out.
It's actually not significant at all that I don't flesh that point out, because my video is a survey of data relevant to the authorship and dating of the Gospel of Mark. That's all it is. It's not a video where I do literary analysis between 2 passages, And so Ijaz here is just trying to score some cheap points with his rhetoric. More.
No cheap points. Your video was targeted at responding to Muslims. I am a Muslim. Farid is a Muslim. We responded to your video about Muslims and their view of the biblical authors. It's that simple. Did I miss something there, Farid? Tell me if I missed something there, please.
I don't think you did.
So
I
it's
don't
not cheap rhetoric. It's taken your purpose, which is the authorial intent behind what you said. It's taken the title of the video and your purpose in publishing the video in the first place. I would suggest, that Colin should watch the very first video you put out about the authorship and the reasons he lists for why he's doing this series. So, Colin.
So I think next time, if we're ever gonna go through any of his, you see, here's the issue. If you critique these points, they're supplementary points. You didn't have to. You're scoring a cheap point by critiquing them. If you don't critique them, you get someone saying, you skipped this because these were strong points. This is an issue.
Yeah, so we have to look at everything that he says and analyze it, right? He's claiming not to do research that would, be determinative. Well, if that's the point, then don't tell Muslims that they're wrong when they say Mark didn't write Mark. You should actually say, yeah, that's actually possible. Why doesn't he say that in those open words? Why? He would lose subscribers and he would lose the faith of the Christians that follow him.
To be fair, I do believe that he believes in it. It's just that he strongly believes in the manuscript evidence, the statements of the early church fathers, and what else? Those were the main things, right? Those were the main things.
Entry, yeah. Let's continue.
Yeah.
More cheap rhetoric and 4313.
We have to keep in mind that there were layered assumptions that have been made to lead Colin to his viewpoint.
This is a frequent accusation that I use layered assumptions. However, this is not the case, and they would be more aware of this had they watched the introduction video that I produced on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. And there I use arguments from Greek syntax and from early manuscripts, as well as some practical considerations. And I also bring in, as Ijaz has noted, arguments from early church history. These are not layered assumptions. These are multiple independent lines of evidence that converge at the same point. And if Ijaz disagrees, then the burden of proof is on him to demonstrate how I'm actually using layered assumptions instead of multiple independent lines of evidence.
Well, Colin, that's why we did an hour-long video. We analyzed each and every claim that you made. Had we done what you did and just cut bits and pieces and responded to those bits and pieces, then that allegation would be valid. But as far as I am aware, we did an hour-plus long video on multiple of them. So we did engage with every evidence that you put forward. This argument about Greek syntax, it's included in this video in Mark, it's included on the video on Matthew, and we break it down ourselves and we look at it as well. So this is a really cheap shot by him to say that we didn't engage with it. We clearly did. Let's continue if possible.
So once again, these are just more rhetorical points. This clip starts at 5043.
Wamberg, with a number of other scholars, puts the dating of Mark's Gospel sometime in the 60s. It is also important to observe that Irenaeus claims only that the transmission of the Gospel occurred after Peter's death, not necessarily its composition. But if Mark wrote during Peter's lifetime, and if the early church tradition can be trusted that Peter was martyred under Nero before AD 68, then Mark must have composed his gospel at some still earlier date, perhaps 64 to 65, when Nero's persecution was beginning.
So this is actually not evidential of anything. This is a person theorizing of what we would call the terminus postquem, the earliest date from which this gospel could have originated.
Pay attention to that. The earliest date from which this gospel could have originated. Keep that in mind. The earliest date.
So I think Colin uses this to say that it can be the origin of this gospel is at that point in time, whereas what Craig Blomberg mentions here is that it could have been or must have been composed at some earlier date. And he specifies that the composition could have begun between 64 to 65. You would notice that the first line, the first sentence, the second line, not necessarily its composition, but rather that which was published at some other point in time. So it seems as if Colin does not understand the context of the quote.
Okay, so you have three dates on your screen, 80, 68, 64, and 65. Which one is Ajaz talking about? Which is the early date that he's talking about? He doesn't say. So let's work through each one of them. Could it be AD 68? No, because the context of Blomberg's quote is referring to the Gospel of Mark being written during Peter's lifetime. And I think we can all agree that the Gospel of Mark cannot have been written during Peter's lifetime after Peter was martyred, which was by AD 68. So AD 68 can't be the date that Ajaz is referring to. What about AD 64 or 65? Well, a couple of paragraphs later in his commentary, Blomberg says, when we come to the introduction of Luke, we will see that a plausible case can be made for dating his gospel to about AD 62. This, therefore, would require Mark to have been written earlier still, though perhaps by only a year or two. So there, Blomberg is talking about Mark being written even earlier than 64 or 65. So no matter which date you use,
the earliest date from which this gospel could have originated,
Ajaz is wrong. But once again, what we have here are rhetorical games.
I'm not sure what I'm wrong about there. My point still stands. That's a possible date of composition, but it is not the form of the text which we have today. I am not sure how that refutes my point. My point simply was you can't go that early, and he's simply saying, Colin agrees as well that we can't go that early, which is why in his initial video he did not use the date of 62. He used the later dates of 65 to 66 and the one with 68. So he agrees with me, so I'm not sure what he's disagreeing in this video with and what he was meant to refute me on when we agree on the same point. Those dates are too early. What's the problem? You tell me, Brother Fury. Let's continue. So that was a non-essential point. And he thinks that by he thinks that responding to me means that we disagree. But the point is, he didn't use that earliest dates of 62 to then say in his video. So the point is, he agrees with me. That's what I want to say. Let's continue, yeah?
This video, 33.
So there's a book by Professor Marcus Bucknell, Simon Peter in Scripture and Memory. And within the very first page, the very first paragraph, I believe he mentions that the search for the historical Peter runs swiftly into the ground.
So let's look at the quote from Marcus Bucknell. Any conventional quest for a historical Peter runs into the ground rather swiftly. What is a conventional quest? Bucknell explains this was the classic conception of Old Testament and New Testament study at the beginning of the 20th century. The real Bible lies buried beneath a strata of centuries of tradition and interpretation, and it is historical criticism's task to recover it. But for all the well-intentioned concern for dispassionate objectivity, it also began to dawn on thoughtful scholars during the last century that the more we keep deconstructing our sources, the taller our speculations become, and the more we are in danger of finding in them mainly ourselves and our view of the world. So Marcus Bucknell is critiquing a certain type of scholarship, this conventional scholarship. He says, but the recollection of the apostles too soon becomes a topic of explicit reflection. Especially in later New Testament books, readers are frequently urged to call to mind the apostles, initially in their absence, but also and increasingly after their death. As a matter of fact, the claims of living apostolic memory continued, surprisingly, for many decades, an observation that runs against ingrained assumptions of much conventional, historical, critical scholarship of early Christianity. And
let's just pause right there very quickly. I'm going to read that line in the third quote, okay? Keep in mind that Colin is appealing to this quote as if the gentleman, Dr. Marcus Bucknell, disagrees with the conclusion. Here's what he says. As a matter of fact, the claims of living apostolic memory continued. So what is a fact? A fact is not that the memory is authentic. Rather, the fact is people claimed to have apostolic memory, which continued in their tradition. Is that clear, Brother Furi?
Right, yeah.
Now, pay attention to this quote. Remember, he is presenting it as if that Dr. Marcus Bucknell disagrees with the conventional views about Peter's authorship of his two letters, yeah? So on the very last line, it says, ingrained assumptions of much conventional, historical, critical scholarship of early Christianity. Unfortunately, Colin made a mistake here. I'll tell you why. This quote actually continues. So in the very next line, this is what he says. As we will see in the next chapter, see 2 Peter under the Petrine letters, a particularly striking example of this concern occurs in 2 Peter, composed perhaps not long after the year AD 100. So he disagrees with their method but comes to the same conclusion that Peter was not the author of the second epistle. You see that problem there. So he's presenting these quotes as if to give the impression this scholar disagrees. Of course, Peter wrote his epistles. Not the case, but let's continue because that's not the only point. I've only responded to Second Peter. What does he also conclude about the first epistle allegedly attributed to Peter? Let me get the quote here. Give me one sec. So here we go. For reasons, so it's on page 89 in his work. He says, for reasons we will advance in the next chapter, First Peter may appropriately be considered as part of the Western memory of Peter. Agreed? So Eastern would be around Jerusalem, that part of the area. Western would be in Rome. So what does he say about the authenticity of the Western memory of Peter? He says here on page 130, all in all, it seems clear that First Peter cannot be seen as a repository of historical Petrine memory or theology. So Habibi Colin, he agrees with the points that we were making. All you had to do in your final quote was read the very next line. But there is a reason that you didn't want to produce it. There is a reason you didn't want to produce the same scholar that you're now appealing to refute me on his very own conclusions is because they agree with me. So Colin, Habibi, pay attention to the sources that you quote. First, you misused Daniel Oluchi, who agreed with us, and secondly, you're misusing Marcus Bucknell because he also agrees with the positions I hold to. Shall we continue, Brother Farid?
Please.
This appeal to scholarship, he's really bad at reading if that's the case. I just want to say that.
And there we have conventional, historical, critical scholarship. Let's go back to our original quote. Any conventional quest for a historical Peter runs into the ground rather swiftly. So now we know what the conventional quest means. It means a conventional, historical, critical quest.
Yeah, but he ends up agreeing with the same conclusions that they come to through a slightly different methodology. Pay attention, Colin.
Now, the presuppositions of this methodology of scholarship go against both Christianity and Islam. And they also go against Marcus Bucknell's goal in this book. Notice the title, Simon Peter in Scripture and what? And memory. What does he talk about down here? As a matter of fact, the claims of the living apostolic memory continued. And this observation goes against ingrained assumptions. And so he criticizes this convention, the historical critical methodology, for its shortcomings. And he lets us know in the title of the book itself that he's going to expand his search beyond that.
Colin, that's why you have to read beyond the title, because he disagrees with what you're claiming here. Just pay attention. I want to point out as well, this is a really bad fallacy he's about to commit. He's basically saying, you Muslims, you don't accept this methodology, right? So why would you appeal to it in the first place? But Colin, we are quoting scholars that you also use. You use Daniel Oluchi, I use Daniel Oluchi. You appeal to New Testament scholarship, I appeal to New Testament scholarship. So basically he's saying we can't use the same kind of scholars that he uses when they disagree with him because we don't believe in the methodology of those scholars in the first place. But Colin, you have set the standard. You have made it seem as if it is okay to quote New Testament scholarship regardless of their presuppositions, because if that was not the case, you would actually be quoting you would not be quoting conservative Christian scholars who believed that the authors of the Gospels are the real people that you actually believe in, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So this, it's it's a bad reason, it's a non-practical. Two, you're about to commit a true quirky because we don't, you can critique our methodology perhaps, but the video that we made was critiquing your methodology as you applied it, not our methodology, to be clear. Let's continue. It might be confusing to some people. Who knows?
That's good.
Now, historical critical methodology has presuppositions that go against both Islam and Christianity. Why Ijaz is appealing to this conventional methodology. He doesn't accept it for his own worldview. Neither do any Muslims, and Christians don't either. It's really good to describe the presuppositions to you. So let me just give you kind of the end result of this type of scholarship. You have things like the similarity of events, correlation, and a closed universe. And so what ends up happening is that every event is seen in this historical critical methodology to be cause and effect. So you go all the way back, the continuum of human history, and what you have is cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, That's it. And there's no transcendent cause. So if we adopt this historical critical methodology, if Ijaz does, he has to reject the notion, for example, that Allah revealed the Quran to Muhammad, because that's transcendent. And there's no proof of that in this historical critical scholarship that Marcus Bachmuel is describing. And so Ijaz is apparently unaware of what this conventional methodology refers to, or he is comfortable with being inconsistent enough to give Christians the result of the conventional search for the historical.
Let me point out here, Brother Farid, is it not correct that I used Marcus Bachmuel's quote, correct?
Yes.
Doesn't he make the argument in this video that Marcus Bachmuel does not use the conventional historical critical method?
Right.
Therefore, how can he claim I'm using scholars that use a conventional historical critical method, which I myself would not accept, when I'm using one of the scholars that disagrees with the conventional historical critical method? Colin, what are you doing? Am I missing something here, Brother Farid? Really? You're quoting the very guy you think I would not quote. Come on now. Let's just continue.
Because if he did, all we would need to do is substitute Muhammad for Peter. And then we would say that the conventional quest for the historical Muhammad runs swiftly into the ground. The conventional quest for the historical Uthman runs swiftly into the ground, and so forth. On and on we could go. But he rejects those presuppositions, and so do Christians. So why is he trying to apply them in the context of the historical Peter?
So yes,
I don't think that's even.
That's a turkey fallacy.
I don't even think that's true.
We don't. I want to point out that plainly scholars do believe that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam existed and that his companions existed. In fact, within history, it's actually only the mythicists who think that they did not exist. And in the same way that we reject Christian mythicists who believe that Jesus never existed, we also reject the people that do the same for Islam. On the other hand, I want to point out some of these irrational people Colin actually appeals to. He appeals to Joseph J. Smith. He appeals to David Wood, who argue that the Quran was not the Quran at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, despite J. Smith writing the opposite in his PhD thesis. So a lot of these guys are inconsistent, and Colin criticizing me is a poor reflection of what he himself has committed himself to. Let's continue, please, because I have better things to do with my life than watch Colin embarrass himself.
4243 asks a question.
How about some of the attributions to Peter are correct?
They could potentially be, but then again, even the authorship of Acts itself is very disputed.
What about some of these attributions of Peter? And Ijaz's response is the authorship of Acts. Absolutely nothing to do with Farid's question, but it's
he misses the point. So what has happened here is Farid asked me a question about Peter. Now, the history of what happened to the apostles after the death and alleged resurrection of Christ is recorded in Acts of the Apostles. And so it is claimed that whoever wrote the Gospel according to Luke also wrote Acts of the Apostles. And one of Colin's claims is that Luke must have been close to Paul and that Mark was writing based on Peter's direct testimony. So all I'm pointing out is that the books are connected and we can actually trace whether or not the historical Peter did certain things. He seems to have missed that point, and I am willing to explain it to him further. I would suggest that there is a wider body of literature that points out these connections. And on the video that we just dropped on Luke, that's exactly what I do. So Colin just needs to pay attention. That's all. Let's continue.
Ijaz just uses it to try to score some more rhetorical points. He uses his question, Farid's question, to give a completely unrelated response on the authorship of Acts. Okay, this next set of clips is from 1645, 1905, 4754, and 4817.
You will see that Tertullian is writing towards the latter half of the 2nd century, maybe early half of the 3rd century, just because the church, and this is not early, by the way, early would be contemporaneous, this is early.
Early will be contemporaneous, meaning when the Gospels were actually written. That's all. Let's continue.
In comparison to the fact that they have nothing early.
Right.
Problems here again. Just because the early tradition says that they got it from the disciples, which they don't necessarily say so, does not mean that the early tradition came from the disciples themselves. So if the authors were the disciples or they knew the disciples, then they should have been able to say, as the church fathers shortly thereafter.
So notice what he's doing. He doesn't want Christians to be able to say we have any early traditions.
Again, I want to point out here there's a difference between early for the Gospels and early for the Church Fathers. So the Church Fathers on their writings primarily after the year 150. Early for the Gospels would be after the year 33 all the way to the year 90. So I'm using two different descriptors to two different categories of things. Colin conflates them and thinks he can use one for the other, but this is a straw man argument and it's a bad one. Let's continue.
And so he redefines early to mean contemporaneous.
Early would be contemporaneous.
So we don't have the early church fathers, we have the contemporaneous church fathers, but the contemporaneous church fathers are called the apostles. They already have a name. So then we have the apostles / the contemporary / early church fathers, and then we move down the line to what?
As the church fathers shortly
thereafter fathers. So we have the contemporaneous early church fathers, which are the apostles, and then we have the shortly thereafter church fathers.
Shortly thereafter, meaning after the year 150, they all seem to coalesce along the point that these were the authors of some of the Gospels. He seems to have missed that, and again, it's a conflation of the points that I was making. Like I said, this is why he had to choose to cut and paste the video, because if you listen to my full articulation, you would actually understand the point I was making. Let's continue.
And so we can see that all he's doing here is playing word games. He doesn't want to use early, but he does acknowledge that we do have early sources, and this comes out occasionally in Freudian slips.
Does not mean that the early tradition, the church fathers, shortly thereafter,
Papias and Eusebius, 703 and 2106.
Right. Papias himself in Church History, Book 3, Chapter 39, actually spells out that Papias is a person who believes wondrous things which are inaccurate.
Is there a reason to assume that Eusebius may have made this up or that he's unreliable?
So Eusebius himself does say that it is okay to lie for the sake of the gospel. He actually uses the word agato sudestai, a good lie. So as long as the lie brings someone to believe, quote unquote, in the truth, it's okay to lie in that sense. He actually quotes Plato in order to justify this claim.
In the book The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Gary Habermas and Michael Kona have a thorough endnote that addresses this issue. When Eusebius refers to falsehood, he is not encouraging Christians to lie for the benefit of the kingdom of Christ. Reason number one, in his comparison with the Hebrew scriptures, he states that thousands of passages similar to Plato's can be found. He then lists a few examples of human passions attributed to God that he claims are adopted for the benefit of those who need this mode of instruction. These are Jewish reasons why one should live a righteous life. The result is that those who are not naturally inclined to live righteously may be encouraged to do so for fear of the consequences. Writers of the Old Testament obviously believed such consequences were real. So in Eusebius' comparison of Plato to the Hebrew scriptures, he is saying that Plato copied the idea from them, that certain devices that do not exactly reflect reality may be used to persuade to live righteously. The Hebrew writers attributed human qualities to God to explain why we should not worship other gods and the reasons behind other laws. Plato copied this principle, says Eusebius, when he wrote that he presented the truth for why men should be moral, because a moral life makes one happier than an immoral one. However, Plato continues, even if he is mistaken and evil men combine, the goal of a moral society is attained. Number two, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures never encourage one to lie. In fact, quite the opposite is true, and then he gives some examples. Number three, a similar section is found in Eusebius' sequel, Proof of the Gospel, about lying to bring people into the kingdom of Christ. However, Eusebius is speaking in a very sarcastic tone and context, clearly intending his readers to understand that such is preposterous. Therefore, there is no reason to believe he would encourage just the opposite in this related writing. Further, Eusebius' examples of anthropotheia or anthropomorphisms indicate that he saw value in offering reasons why one should be righteous, namely that this may motivate those to be righteous who would not normally be inclined to do so. God may not sleep or experience jealousy as humans do, but these figures of speech, good lies, motivate people to live righteously. Thus, Eusebius has demonstrated how the Greeks have borrowed from the older Hebrew, which is the intent of the passage. The assertion that Eusebius encouraged deceit should be rejected. At the very least, his solitary statement cannot be taken as having proved this to be his meaning. But the question in context that Farid is asking is more about Eusebius quoting his sources, not what Eusebius says about the gospel or the Christian faith. And what Eusebius scholars have noted is that Eusebius does quote his sources accurately where we can check them. He quotes them accurately. However, he does want to steer his readers in a particular direction. And so, for example,
how do we
I
know?
want to pause
How do we know that he's quoting?
So,
How do we know that he's
so
quoting his sources accurately?
one second. So we'll get to that. Please keep that question in mind. But here's the problem. A number of years ago, I actually wrote an article on this claim of Eusebius. And I actually cite Gary Habermas and Michael O'Connor myself. So in that article, which I guess we'll link in the description, it actually says, here's how they say that they will translate it. One translator renders the term as useful fiction instead of falsehood. That does not make it better. So all they're saying is that the translation is correct. Good lie. Agato sudestai. Good lie. And what they want to argue, they state plainly on that in that same work. They state, however, Plato's context and the passage may justify a nuance for the following reasons. One, Plato uses the term good lie, agato sudestai, eliminating harmful intent. So they are interpreting it to mean, well, yes, it does say good lie, but he means good lie, but he doesn't mean it in a bad way. A lie is still a lie in this case. So that does not make sense. You take it on face value. He says good lie, and they approve of the translator who calls it useful fiction. I wonder if Colin agrees with Gary Habermas that if you use that translation from Eusebius, that the Gospels could contain useful fiction. Would he agree with that? I don't think he would. So that translation still points out the contradiction in his reasoning. What was your question again, Brother Farid?
I was asking, Colin points out that it's all about Eusebius's quoting and his...
Plato.
Say again?
Quoting Plato, yeah.
Quoting whom?
Plato.
I wasn't referring to that. Quoting the earlier sources and doing a good job at that. So what's the evidence for that?
Actually, it's quite little, and if I can just that same article by Daniel Olucci, he actually answers this question for us. Do you mind if I read it?
Yeah, please.
So one of the scholars that Colin appealed to, Daniel Olucci, actually speaks on this point about Eusebius and his reliability. Here's what he says from page 102. The dating of the Gospels is, of course, a contentious issue that cannot be fully addressed here. I will assume a general range of the year 70 to the year 120 for the composition of all four texts. The earliest evidence for the traditional naming comes from the early 2nd century figure Papias. He records half of the traditional Christian model, claiming that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. Peter's spokesperson and the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, who collected the sayings in the Hebrew language and each interpreted them as able. Our access to Papias, however, is via Eusebius, and we cannot be sure of either the date of Papias's writing or of the accuracy of Eusebius's quotation. If the quote is genuine, it means that at least half of what would become the traditional ascriptions existed by the early 2nd century. Nothing is sure here, however. It is possible that Eusebius has pushed the naming tradition earlier than it in fact existed, either by intentionally falsifying the Papias quote or unintentionally repeating a false tradition about Papias. Sure evidence for the existence of the traditional ascriptions comes from Irenaeus writing around 190. Irenaeus repeats the same story as Papias regarding Matthew and Mark, and he adds that the Gospel of Luke was written by a companion of Paul, and that the Gospel of John was written in Ephesus by the disciple John. Tertullian, writing only slightly later, also knows the Gospels by name and the tradition that John and Matthew were disciples, while Mark and Luke recorded material from Peter and Paul. What would become the traditional naming myth was thus in existence by the late 2nd century at the latest. So far, we agree with this. This is what we've claimed in our own videos. However, he continues, the time span in which the text circulated anonymously thus hinges significantly on the veracity of Eusebius's quotation of Papias and, of course, the dating of the text. There is no way to prove the point one way or the other, but I think we are justified in being skeptical of the Papias tradition. Eusebius's fleeting quote from Papias is suspiciously useful to his overall arguments that Eusebius's form of Christianity is the only true form because their texts derive from apostolic authority, unlike the texts of heretics. Moreover, even if the Papias quote is genuine, it only accounts for Matthew and Mark, and Eusebius is presumably unable to produce any earlier evidence for the antiquity of apostolic attribution. This is the central argument. So we may be fairly certain that if Eusebius were aware of any other evidence for the antiquity of the traditional names, he would state it here, end quote. And that is on page 103. So in all that I have said, he equally argues that we need to be suspicious of the Eusebian tradition and the fact that he could not cite anyone before Papias, that is within the 1st century, that alludes to the authorship by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is an argument from silence, which is valid, because if he can quote Papias, why could he not quote someone earlier in the tradition? He does not quote someone earlier in the tradition because nothing existed ascribing authorship at that point in time. He needs to read what he quotes better. That is why I said that article by Daniel Olucci, thank you for giving it attention, because it responds to your exact point. Shall we continue, Brother Farouk?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Remember,
Very
this is a Muslim conspiracy. We're making it up as we go along. No, we go to scholarship. Let's continue.
Example, he quotes Papias accurately. As far as we can tell, what Papias says about Matthew and Mark is repeated in Irenaeus. And so he quotes Papias. However, he doesn't want his readers to go with some of Papias's doctrine, so he criticizes Papias at the same time. So he quotes the sources, but he does try to steer his readers in a direction, and this is why we see him criticizing Papias as not.
Here's a challenge to the Christians that are watching this video. Go to Colin and ask him, why didn't Eusebius or Irenaeus or anyone else quote what Papias had to say about the authorship of Luke and John? Let's just see what he says. Let's take it from there. Let's be patient and see what happens. Go to him and ask. Actually, I think he just mentioned the Presbyter John. But let's just see what he says about the other Gospels and why he offers no evidence for them. Let's continue, yeah?
Being too sharp. This clip starts at 33:23.
So everyone generally believes that the gospel is homonymous. That's a form of anonymity, meaning it's just a popular name used at that time.
Okay.
And this is the standard position.
When Ijaz says everyone generally believes this or that, we have to look at the actual claim that he's making. So here's a quote from Simon Gathercole. The canonical Gospels are usually classed very much on the more anonymous side, but surprisingly, this apparent anonymity of the Gospels has received relatively little scholarly attention. And Daniel Ulucci, that we heard from earlier, says the standard critical model is far shakier than many imagine. And so it's not just a matter of saying everyone believes.
Can we just pause there? So I do appreciate that our friend here, Colin, is appealing to Daniel Ulucci. So what he doesn't tell you is the conclusion of Daniel Ulucci. So I read this one before, I'll read it again. He says, nevertheless, so he quoted from page 103. I will be quoting from page 106. Here's what he says on page 106 about the overall conclusions about the scholars who use the standard conventional model. He says, I would like to suggest that materialist approaches can provide firmer ground for the basic claims of the standard critical model. I am arguing that the basic conclusions of the standard critical model are correct, though for the wrong reasons. So he's not disagreeing with the conclusions. He agrees with the conclusions. He just disagrees with the model and its interpretations. That's all. So Colin kind of misrepresents what he is critiquing, not the conclusions, but the model. Furthermore, Colin did mention that when I said the majority of New Testament scholars held the view that the Gospels' authorship was anonymous, he used a quote from Simon Gathercole in which he says that that's not the case. However, quoting from Daniel Ulucci's work on page 98, here's what he says. Nevertheless, the assumption that the Gospels were intentionally written anonymously has become nearly standard in New Testament studies. So the authority that he's appealing to agrees with my view that this is the consensus view. So I'm not sure why Colin found it useful to produce Simon Gathercole, who chooses an opposite direction, whereas the very paper Colin appealed to says exactly what I said. He needs to pay attention and read the sources that he is quoting as opposed to trying to cherry pick his arguments. Let's continue, please.
Believes this, others believe this. We have to actually look at how many scholars have specifically studied the issue themselves and how many are simply jumping on board with what may be a mainstream view. Gathercole continues, the apparent anonymity of the Gospels is a neglected topic in New Testament studies. The main body of the argument is in two parts. First, anonymity cannot be inferred from an absence of authorial self-reference in the body of the work, and therefore the argument that the Gospels are anonymous because they do not contain the author's names is invalid, and I have in brackets why, and we'll see why later. Secondly, and more positively, while the titles contained in the earliest Gospel manuscripts may well in their present form be secondary, this does not exclude earlier attributions of authorship made in some other way. Practical considerations make the presence of the author's names very likely. Second-century Christian literature is replete with references to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authors of Gospels, and there is never any sense that the Gospels were anonymous or written by others.
So quickly here, Simon Gathercole is a conservative Christian. This is what he believes in as a matter of faith. However, you and I already responded to this point in our Mark video. In our Mark and Matthew video. I want to point out that Simon Gathercole appeals to what? The manuscript evidence, the same evidence which I used to point out that P1 does not have a title. So in any case, Colin is merely repeating his old arguments, which we've already responded to, without looking at our initial arguments against these cases. Let's continue. So this is evidential of nothing, and he does not engage with what we've said. He's merely repeating the same claim over and over again.
The most likely conclusion to be drawn is that the attributions of authorship are original. But I do want to stress that it's not just as simple as looking at manuscripts, as we saw earlier. Gathercole is quoting Simon Swain here. He says, it is perfectly normal for literary works to begin without a reference to their author. The author's name should already be known to the reader or hearer from the usual devices.
Pay attention now. He's saying that there is no need to have the author's name on the document. But Colin himself was arguing that the titles circulated with the Gospels. What do we call that? A contradiction, an error in reasoning. So thank you, Colin, for self-refuting. You've done our job for us, Habibi. We congratulate you. Let's continue.
There's much more as well end where we began with the titles of the Gospels. In summary, we've seen overstatements, strawman fallacies, and non sequiturs. We've seen incomplete engagement. They presented part of my arguments to their audience as if they were the whole of my arguments. And we've seen their methodology at work, striving toward what I call vague agnosticism. Striving toward vague agnosticism. That's the goal. Whatever conclusion Ijaz ends at, it's just agnosticism. He wants to be able to say, we don't know about all of these issues surrounding the New Testament and the Bible as a whole.
Doesn't Colin himself in this video said that all the things that he demonstrated do not prove the case that these were the authors? So he himself doesn't know. He's just suggesting as he claimed. So to say Ijaz strives for agnosticism when you admitted that yourself, I think that's a bit hypocritical. I'm just putting that out there. Let's continue. I want to point out as well, he says that we use non sequiturs. We responded to that. Yeah, almost everything that he lists, we have engaged with. Let's continue because he repeats that slide a number of times.
Whole. Once again, this shouldn't be surprising. This is where Ehrman ends up, and Ijaz is nothing more than a popular level Ehrman. I have Peter down there.
He calls me a popular level Ehrman. Very quickly, Brother Farid, did we reference any of Pat Ehrman's works in our videos? No. Otherwise, Colin would have showed it. Was Marcus Buckmull Pat Ehrman? No. Was Gary Habermas and Michael O'Connor Pat Ehrman? No. Was Philip Comfort Pat Ehrman? No. So all of the scholars that we quoted largely come from a conservative brand of Christianity. He, on the other hand, is saying we only appeal to Pat Ehrman type scholarship. He's contradicting himself. Otherwise, he would not have gone to the quotes of the people I myself used. He doesn't call any of them Bat Ehrman, does he? This, again, is a cheap straw man attack. It's an ad hominem as well. The point is, he could not refute our direct points So he chooses to attack us as individuals. Colin thinks, and I want to point this out here because other people have mentioned this as well, that by him producing these videos, he is a scholar himself. He thinks that his videos are a work of scholarship itself. Now, Brother Farid, is it impossible for you and I to sit down and quote Christian scholars in videos? Is that impossible for us to do?
Of course not.
No, it's easy for anyone to do that. So, Colin, just to point out, what you do does not make you special. Stop being a snowflake. Anyone can make the videos that you do. Just read from people you already agree with. That does not make you intelligent and it does not make you special. It just makes you another missionary YouTuber. You're not special, okay? Let's continue.
As a specific example,
Hurts.
It
he's
should.
willing to put up historical, critical presuppositions and import them into his argument against Peter, against the reliability.
I challenge Colin to use the same arguments that J. Smith does against the Quran for the New Testament's authorship and preservation. He's telling me that I use that methodology. I've already responded to that point earlier. I beg him, you appeal to J. Smith, you appeal to David Wood, you appeal to all these miscreants in society, then use their methodology and apply it to the Bible and tell me what you come out with. Simple request. That is something he will never do.
Of characters in the New Testament. And I also have titles as an example. Once again, he's willing to disregard all of the manuscripts with titles and point to P1, which is fragmentary, as evidence to contradict D.A. Carson and
I went to
So is
P1 because it's the earliest manuscript that survives where we should expect a title. All the others that you appeal to were after that time. So he's basically saying Ijaz is wrong for going for the earliest evidence, and I should actually believe in the 4th, 5th, 6th century evidence. No, what I did was reasonable. Remember, he's claiming to go back to the earliest church fathers and understanding their method and their evidences. So what is wrong with me going to the earliest manuscript with the first page of the Gospel of Matthew where we would expect the title? There's nothing wrong with that. He's just taking a cheap shot here. Very, very shameless, I have to tell you.
his methodology. Strive toward agnosticism. Always find something that you can use to say that we don't know.
No. What I am doing is more than that. You present evidences in response to Muslims, yes? So I, as the Muslim, took up that challenge. It is my responsibility to look at the claims that you have made, analyze them, and respond to them. Brother Farid, we did an hour for almost each gospel, yes? Right,
Yeah.
so we took our time to address every point you made. Otherwise, we could have done a 10-minute video, say you were wrong, and move on. So basically, Colin is saying, I and Farid are wrong for engaging with each and every evidence he has presented, and I and Brother Farid are wrong for realizing that there are issues with the evidences he has provided. Part of a dialogue is that you assess your opponent's or your interlocutor's evidences. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the entirety of Collins's channel, Islam Critiqued, is to do exactly that. Look for minor problems in Islamic theology or fiqh, whatever the case may be, or history, and then produce videos on that. So how can you sit there as a shameless coward and say that what we are doing is wrong when your channel is premised upon that very basis? Please, Colin, stop wasting my time. Let's continue.
Apply skepticism as necessary, ignoring consistencies ad infinitum. And we talked about this with early sources and Eusebius and his quote about lies. And we've seen how that works today. We don't know who wrote Mark, and even if we did know that Mark wrote Mark, we wouldn't know which Mark we were talking about. And yes, there's a mention of a Mark. Throughout the New Testament, he travels, it seems, in the apostolic circles. But we can't really be sure of anything because we don't know who wrote the book of Acts. And yes, this Mark is mentioned in 1 Peter, but we don't know who this Peter guy is anyway, especially if we apply historical critical presuppositions to the question. But then we move into the church fathers. They do say some relevant things like Papias, but then we can use Eusebius to dismiss Papias, and after we use Eusebius to dismiss Papias, we can use Eusebius to dismiss himself. And so any barrier of evidence that Jaws runs into, he just raises that level of skepticism high enough to get over it.
Those are good points, though.
Well, do you realize what he said? He raises the barrier of evidence to just get over it, which means what? That the evidences that we have produced overcome his claims. This is a concession that what we have said refutes him. Like he says, it just comes over. Khalas, the matter is done. We have fulfilled what he thought we could not do. I want to point out as well, in scholarship, there is the idea that every claim must be evaluated on its own merits. So you appeal to Papias, I look at Papias, his history, what literature has survived, what he means by what he says, what his scholars have interpreted to mean. And we find issues in all those 5 areas, and then we engage with them. That is called being responsible, because we are not a people of blind faith. In fact, our Deen calls us to seek knowledge wherever it may be. Rabbi zidni ilma, my Lord, increase me in knowledge. That is what we seek and strive for as Muslims. This is why I cannot be a Christian, because as Colin rightly points out, I have to assume too many things, and I have to give the benefit with a lack of doubt and a lack of critical thinking to believe in the first place. As a Muslim, I need to have critical thinking. My aql must be high. It can't be low on the ground. Otherwise, I would be like Colin. Let's just wrap up. We've got 1 minute left. Brother Fui, do you have any comments on what he just said?
Not really. I just wanna finish that one last minute because
Yeah, I
there's
know.
something that I'm itching to get out. But
I know.
yeah,
Let me just respond to this one point. He says it was wrong of me to assess Papias and then to use Eusebius to assess Papias as well. This is
right.
incorrect. Why? Because if Eusebius quotes Papias and Papias is unreliable, and then Eusebius himself is reliable, it tells us that the meta-narrative in and of itself cannot be qualified, cannot be demonstrated, and that there are severe historical problems with it. It would be foolish of me to see these problems and not speak on them. Otherwise, I would just be confirming a narrative that Colin wants me to give, that I just close my eyes, ignore the problems. But the problems are there, and unfortunately, if they weaken themselves, then that's not my fault. It's what they themselves present. So the problem is not me or my methodology. The problem is that the people that you're appealing to have significant issues with them themselves. That's all. Let's continue. 1 more minute left, inshallah.
My favorite clip of all.
Is this overwhelming you, the information? You thought about this like this.
It's not overwhelming me. I'm assuming it's going to be overwhelming him if he watches this. I'm sure he will.
Overwhelmed. Not quite. I spend all of my time in academic literature, and watching a 1-hour discussion between Fareed and Ijaz is a gigantic step down. And so here we see the difference between the level of material Fareed thinks he's putting out and the level of material that he actually is putting out. All right, why I won't do any more response videos. They are, as I said, a gigantic step down. They're also not a wise use of my time. If you have 1 hour and you're going to read a journal article or watch a video on Fareed Responds, which one do you think is more intellectually stimulating?
Can you pause?
And predictable methodology.
Yes, please.
So you can't compare it to a random journal article because this is a direct criticism to you, Colin. It's a direct criticism against your holy book, and you're being refuted for your content. I would assume that you'd care about that more than some random journal article that doesn't address you. So yeah.
This is a silly point as well. I just want to say, I understand why Colin would not want to do responses to us, because like he said, we overcame that barrier of evidence. He said it in his own words. If I were you, Brother Fareed, I would clip that section and put it on a 10-hour repeat on YouTube. We have done what he thinks we were unable to do. Let's continue. About 40 seconds left.
Yeah.
That is, they're just popular level bar
Not
affirmance.
popular level,
All you
no.
want them to do when they interact with these topics is drive toward vague agnosticism. That's what they want to get to. They don't have any alternative explanations. They just, at the end of the day, want to be able to say, I don't know. And since I don't know, you can't know either. And audiences, when you go to the comment sections of these response channels, they appear to me to be people who simply want to hear things that confirm what they already believe. And so I can't justify using my time to produce content for people who don't want to hear it anyway. And so I must choose to use my limited time in a more productive way. First response video, last response video. Let's get on to some things that are more productive.
Wow, man. No, this is Akhi, shuf, subhanallah, bro. Subhanallah, subhanallah. I've how many videos, man, have I made against Christian Prince, man? It's friggin' like 30 or something. And I go to his comment section and I'm like, it's like pulling my hair out. But there's that one person there that once in a while says something like, maybe Fareed has a point. Wallahi, akhi, to me, that's sufficient.
I just want to say that this video for me confirms in my heart that Colin is not just misguided in his aspirations. He actually thinks that by quoting scholars on a YouTube video, he has become a scholar himself and that he does not need to respond to us. The point simply is that you have made claims based on some alleged scholarship. We have analyzed those claims and responded to them fairly. And you yourself now, in a 37-minute video, had to call scholars on the phone. That's how much it disturbed you, our video. Call scholars on the phone to refute us. And in the end, you agree that we overcame your quote-unquote barrier of evidence, that we overcame it, Colin. Those words, wallahi, settled the matter. We have overcome each and every evidence you have attempted to produce, and they have been refuted in total. And that is why the Lord of the world says, surely truth has come and falsehood has been vanquished. SubhanAllah.
Akhi, now the problem is, I was about to say some stuff that's deep, but like you ended it with that, and now I can't like top that. So, like I feel almost obligated to end this, broadcast.
It's up to you, Habib.
You ruined it for me. You ruined it for me. So anyways,
This one I have will never be ruined, I'm telling you.
yeah. Okay. So he says, you're trying to push for this agnosticism in regards to the evidence that's being presented, and he says that we don't. Oh, so Ijaz is arguing that we don't know which mark it is. We don't know if Papias is reliable. We don't know if Eusebius is reliable. What else?
That's basically that the church fathers are unreliable or they're just
Yes.
copying traditions. And
Okay,
that the
so we
manuscript
have.
evidence exists, but it disagrees with him.
Okay, so we have 5. Okay, so let's assume the manuscript evidence is fine. Let's assume Eusebius is reliable, Papias is reliable, the manuscript evidence is sufficient, and that Mark is Mark, and not some other random Mark that's whatever. My main issue, Akhi, in the video, I don't know, he's ignoring me, Akhi. He's focusing on your stuff, man. My main argument in the video was, assuming that Mark is Mark, how do we know that all his information is from Peter?
That's the problem.
Yeah, and why is Mark reliable in the first place? It's just that. He never says Peter said to me. He never mentions a single one of his sources in the whole book. That's the main argument I put forward. It's a very simple argument. It's the simplest possible argument. But that was completely ignored. And I was assuming that there'd be more of an engagement with that. So, yeah.
I think that settles the matter. Do you have any concluding words, Brother Farid?
I do not. Do you?
I'm actually out of words because if I had any more, we would be here several more hours. The amount of mistakes that this guy's make in his research and in his reasoning, it's just a waste of time. But subhanAllah, I will say, Brother Farid, on Twitter and on YouTube, the comments in response to our videos have been magnificent, particularly from former Christians as well. So the message is getting through, and we want to thank Colin for giving us the opportunity to bring Christians to Islam. You are a good and very precious tool for the growing of the Ummah, for the growing of the people of Islam. May Allah reward you for that beautiful, beautiful job that you've done for us. Thank you, Colin.
I got nothing more to add.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.